first few days of the month of August, meaning the countdown is on as we await the expected or anticipated and widely rumored potential charges and indictments coming from Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis in regards to Donald Trump and his Republican allies who may have attempted to overturn Georgia's 2020 presidential election. Welcome to this week's edition of Political Update here in the Atlanta News First digital studios here in Midtown Atlanta. I'm Tim Darnell, joined by our producer Maria Moreau and our political reporter Doug Reardon. And Doug, you've been on site downtown Atlanta around the Fulton County Courthouse, and we have seen increased security barriers being placed around the courthouse. Tell us what's going on down there.
Yeah, well, almost like clockwork, Tim, the window that Fani Willis had set aside for these indictments to possibly come was between July 31st and September 1st, so likely sometime in the month of August. And just yesterday we saw around the Fulton County Courthouse those orange barriers that go up when you're talking about large-scale events, whether it's like the Super Bowl or something to this extent, where you're expecting large crowds and potentially rowdy crowds. You know, we saw the scenes play out in New York City and in South Florida when former President Donald Trump was hit with indictments there of large crowds of his supporters and large crowds of counter-protesters as well that were, largely peaceful but very, very massive in their scope. And so the Fulton County Courthouse is taking precautions early, even though we don't know when these indictments will come. We know that these barriers going up are a pretty good indication that they very well could come soon. The other thing, too, is Willis, in that note where she laid out the timeline, had told Fulton County court employees, those who could do so, to work from home. And so I was walking around the building a little bit yesterday. It was noticeably more empty than a typical day where you'd go there to cover something in court. And so certainly if this were to happen, we are getting close. We are in the window now. Fulton County Sheriff's Department that building is within their jurisdiction, although they really don't have any grip over what happens outside of the 4 blocks that surround that building. That is in their jurisdiction, and so they have provided updates as far as what they are going to do to try and keep things safe. Those barriers are a big part of it. We know that they're devoting a lot of staff to this, but that is in their jurisdiction. They are tasked with keeping that building safe, especially in cases where, again, we're expected to see a lot of people. So we know that special grand jury has been seated. We know that they are going through evidence in this case, hearing from witnesses in this case right now. It's just a matter of when they're going to pass up potentially indictments to District Attorney Willis, who said this weekend, she told some media this weekend, she is done with her portion of the investigation. Now she's just waiting on that special grand jury to either recommend or not recommend any indictments.
And the grand jury, as you said, is still currently hearing testimony. We've heard reports of individuals who have been called to testify just within the last several days. And it was interesting you mentioned that when the former President Donald Trump was indicted in New York City on possibly falsifying business reports, as well as in Miami with the special prosecutor Jack Smith, who has leveled several very serious felony indictments regarding his alleged mishandling of classified documents. Fulton County officials and law enforcement sent representatives to both of those cities to observe those kind of security precautions.
Right. They sent people down there to both South Florida and to New York City, like you said, to just kind of see how these proceedings would play out because, if anything, they expect it to be just as much of a spectacle here as it was in those two areas. So they seem to be, by all measures, prepared for this. Again, they are giving us updates as we get closer to this possible date of any indictments coming down, and so they're certainly ready for this. It's not the first large-scale event that they've had to deal with. They are well adept at doing this type of thing, they tell us, but certainly with all of the gravity around the situation, it is something they anticipate, these large crowds and potentially rowdy crowds.
And let's talk a little bit more about the Fulton County District Attorney herself. She is serving her first term and has already undertaken 2 major criminal trials, not only of the rapper known as Young Thug and the YSL gang, but also her investigation into that's been going on for almost well over 2.5 years regarding potential election malfeasance from the former president or his Republican allies. She shared earlier this week at least one very threatening email her office, and she indicated that this is not a unique instance. We won't repeat the contents of the email, obviously, but her office and her staff is working remotely, from what I understand, for the first couple of weeks this month in anticipation of possible security issues.
Right, and we got a copy of that email yesterday. Her office gladly sent it to us because they're telling us, and this is a direct quote from that email that the district attorney had forwarded to several county officials and law enforcement officials, that it's not unusual, and in fact it is pretty typical of them to receive these in the past 2.5 years that they've been undertaking this election interference investigation again into the former president and some of his allies here in Georgia. Just with the high profile nature of this, it is of course something that a lot of people are paying attention to, and so she shared that email with those county officials, and then they shared it with us. Really just some really disturbing language that was used in that email. And again, I think that's why the Fulton County Sheriff's Office is really paying very close attention to this and putting in every precaution that you could think of to make sure that things don't get out of hand. There have been indications, of course, like that email, that people are very stirred up emotionally about this, and so you can expect that when any indictments do come, this is going to be something that angers quite a few people, certainly many of the former president's supporters here in Georgia, who have been paying attention to this over the last 2.5 years. And so Willis told all those county officials, that included Fulton County commissioners, members of city government and law enforcement, she said, keep your staffs safe and pay attention this August. Make sure you keep your head on a swivel while you're walking around downtown. So that was unsettling, certainly, to hear. But as she said, it's not anything that they haven't been getting over the last 2.5 years while this investigation has been going on.
All of this is transpiring as the president, former president, and his Atlanta-based attorneys are continuing their attempts to not only disqualify DA Willis from further investigation, but also to quash the special grand jury report. Last week, or earlier this week, I should say, the Fulton County Superior Court Judge Robert McBurney again denied attempts from the president's attorneys here in Atlanta to stop this investigation from going forward. This has been about 3 or 4 times the president's Atlanta-based attorneys have made these kind of legal attempts. Something tells me they're not quite through in terms of trying to prevent this from going any farther forward.
Right. Well, they're running out of time, truth be told, because again, we know that we're in this window now where the indictments could come. But for again another time, yes, you're right. Judge McBurney had thrown out a motion to disqualify this time District Attorney Fani Willis from actually continuing in her investigation and from allowing that special grand jury report that took a very long time to put together from entering this case, in this investigation. All of the findings that they had, Trump's attorneys were trying to get it all thrown out, and the judge said absolutely not. So now District Attorney Willis can stay on this case. The special grand jury report can come in this investigation. Of course, that contains all sorts of information that we haven't seen yet because it's only been partially released. But it's getting to the point now where the Trump legal team seems to be kind of grasping at straws to get any headway in this case and get a leg up on the district attorney, but it's just not working. So again, we expect if the indictments are going to come, they'll come sometime in the next couple weeks, and it will be too late for the Trump team to do anything about it.
So that's why we here in Atlanta News First are on standby from now until whenever these announcements or indictments, if they come down at all, are announced. And thanks to our great team of broadcast reporters and digital producers here at AtlantaNewsFirst.com. We have extensive coverage of these potentially historic indictments on our AtlantaNewsFirst.com homepage, including a list of all the key figures in this investigation, a timeline of the investigation that began more than 2.5 years ago, and an examination and explanation of the controversy and the other legal issues the nation's 45th president is encountering, not only here in Atlanta, but New York and Miami and elsewhere across the nation. A key element of the district attorney's investigation involves the Electoral College, and our colleague, Chief Investigative Reporter Brendan Keefe, produced recently this very easy, quick explanation on how the Electoral College works, as well as how the former president may have tried to overturn the outcome of Georgia's 2020 presidential election.
I'm Chief Investigator Brendan Keefe with Atlanta News First Investigates, and what we're looking at is the electors who met in Georgia on December 14th of 2020. What are electors? Well, this is the Electoral College you always hear about. When you vote, you actually choose a candidate for president that you want to be president, but you're not actually voting for the president, you're voting for that candidate's slate of electors. And then those electors meet in the state capitals all across the country, and they cast their ballots for that candidate, their electors that the candidate has picked as their slate. This all sounds like inside baseball, and it usually is. We don't usually hear about this, but it's actually come to the fore in the January 6th investigation and in the investigation here in Georgia that Fani Willis, the district attorney for Fulton County, has been looking into. Because these electors that, remember, Joe Biden won Georgia narrowly, and then once he did, his slate of electors on December 14th were supposed to meet at the state capitol and cast ballots for Joe Biden, which they did inside the General Assembly at the state capitol. They're supposed to do this at the state capitol. It's required. Then what happens is they send those votes, those ballots from the electors to Washington, where they're opened by the vice president in front of the Senate, and they're tallied up. And that is what happens on January 6th. What was supposed to happen on January 6th? They open the official ballots from the electors, they certify the election. But something else happened in 2020, and that has been the subject of a criminal investigation, more than one, federal, also state investigations. And that's because some Trump electors also met in the state capitol at the same time, not only here in Georgia, but also in Michigan, in Nevada, in Arizona. And what they did is these, again, were the Trump slate of electors. He didn't win those states, but what happened is the Trump electors cast their ballots for Donald Trump to be reelected as president. They signed a document certifying that they were the duly elected electors for that state, and then those ballots were sent to Washington, to the U.S. Senate, and also to the National Archives. And that detail is what's going to be critical in those other states, but not Georgia, and let me explain why. Fani Willis, the district attorney in Fulton County here in Georgia, gave immunity to some of those Trump electors. Now, you'll see in some media reports people call them the fake electors, while those on Donald Trump's side will call them the alternate electors. The defense, the argument is that these were essentially, it was like a mulligan. It was a provisional, like you'd say in golf, where they were doing this just in case Donald Trump prevailed in court. What they could do is then take those electors' ballots and then certify those ballots instead of the Joe Biden ones if Donald Trump was able to prove some level of fraud in Georgia or Michigan or Arizona or Nevada or these other states that were contested. And the reason that they said they needed those provisional ballots was that there are all of these deadlines along the way as part of the Electoral College process that are codified in law and in the U.S. Constitution. And if those little deadlines aren't met, then you don't have a duly elected president. The other side is arguing, that would be the side saying that this was all a farce or even an illegal attempt to overthrow the results of the 2020 election by Donald Trump and his supporters. They will say, no, these were fake electors. And the key point is that in these states, like Georgia, they certified, we are the duly elected electors for the state of Georgia, and we are casting these official ballots. And they knew that wasn't the case because they were not the duly elected electors. Joe Biden's electors were the duly elected electors. And again, it sounds like inside baseball, but that's really important. If you're putting your name on something and saying something isn't true, and then sending that document off to the federal government to affect the outcome of an election, that could be a crime. And that's what Michigan determined. The Michigan Attorney General actually went ahead and indicted some of the Trump electors saying they are fake electors and they committed a crime and they were going to be prosecuted, at least at this point. That is not going to happen for the vast majority of electors here in Georgia because District Attorney Fani Willis gave them that immunity, and that means she valued them more as witnesses than as defendants. Or she may have determined they didn't commit a crime and she just wanted their testimony. But in either case, those electors who were granted immunity will not be prosecuted by the District Attorney in Fulton County for sitting in the Capitol in Fulton County and attesting that they were the duly elected electors of the state of Georgia when they weren't. But that then raises the question, was Fani Willis trying to go for a bigger fish? The suggestion is that is the case because if you're going to give someone immunity, you're saying, you know what, this defendant isn't as important as whom they can testify against. And that would technically be Donald Trump, which obviously we know he has been the main target of Fani Willis's investigation, but then there are also others, and that's all we know that because of the grand jury report that the former president has gone to great lengths to try to suppress. The Georgia Supreme Court actually ruled against Donald Trump trying to suppress that document, and that's how we ended up here where we are today, and why we're looking at this fake electors issue, because fake electors or provisional electors or alternate electors, whatever you want to call them, they met on that same day in a different room in the state capitol, technically following all the rules except where they attested to being the official elected electors for the state of Georgia, because that simply was not true. Be sure to check out more of our content on Atlanta News First Investigates and AtlantaNewsFirst.com as it relates to Fani Willis's investigation and all of our investigations from Atlanta News First Investigates. I'm Chief Investigator Brendan Keefe.